In the previous control, we curbed core animation's animation. But for this control, we're going to embrace the animation. Office parties can be expensive, so we're going to create a budget control in the shape of an arc. We'll have 2 layers, and we'll use a stepper control to add dollars that we spend and advance the top layer with animation. UI Bezier Path has an arc initializer with a few parameters that we'll take a look at here. An arc is a circle with a section cut out of it, and it has a center and it has a radius. In the core animation coordinate system, the start of the circle is at the right-hand side and degrees increment in a clockwise direction. Our starting point for this arc is going to be at 135 degrees, and that's where the second layer will start from, and it'll grow to its stroke end at 45 degrees. The direction of the arc is therefore clockwise. If we were to go clockwise from 45 degrees to 135 degrees, we'd get the gap filled in instead of the arc. We'll then put a second arc on top of that one and animate it. In computer graphics and drawing, we don't generally use degrees as the rotation unit. We use radians. Working with circles, radians is actually easier than degrees, as a full circle is the same as 2 pi radians. That's 360 degrees. A half circle is therefore pi radians, and that's equivalent to 180 degrees. A quarter circle is pi over 2 radians, and that's 90 degrees. So you look at the point on the circle and work out what fraction of pi it is. Our arc will go clockwise from 3/4 pi to 1/4 pi.
Build and run the starter app and load up the budget control. The app is set up similar to the previous control with 2 shape layers. The 2 layers are in a straight line, and we're going to convert them into an arc shape. Instead of using a pan gesture to move the top layer as we did in the thermometer control, I've set up a stepper. And when we tap the stepper, the dollar value goes up and the top layer fills out the stroke. Notice the implicit animation. That happens automatically with no added code. In the app, open up preview.storyboard and option click budget view.swift to open it in the assistant editor. Choose the budget scene, and I'll make some room here. You can see that I've set up the control exactly the same as the previous one. The view is IB designable, and I've done awake from nib, prepare for interface builder, and setup so that we can preview the result on the storyboard. Layout subviews is where we set up the layer shape, calling build layer. We do it here because we're reliant on the view's bounds, and this is where they've been fully initialized after evaluating auto layout constraints. And the last method is where we set up the interface of the view with the label and stepper auto layout. Let's create the arc in build layer, which is currently where we create the straight line. We'll set the start angle to 135 degrees, which is 3/4 of pi, and the end angle to 45 degrees, which is 1/4 of pi. Set the center to the view center, and the radius of the arc to be the width of the view less a bit. Now we have enough information to build the arc, and we'll change the UI Bezier path. And that appears in the storyboard preview. Let's get rid of the straight lines and build and run to check the arc. And that looks great. The control is currently animating, But we don't have a lot of control over this animation. For example, I can't change how long the animation takes. So let's take a look at what happens behind the scenes of animation.
Let's say that we have two layers and we want to animate the top one using CA Basic Animation. Behind the scenes, a new layer is created called the presentation layer. This layer is a copy of the initial layer, and the initial layer is called the model layer. It's the presentation layer that animates, and the model layer doesn't change. So let's see that in action.
Back in Budget View in Current Value, this is where we set the foreground layer's stroke end, and we're going to create a CA Basic animation. This allows us to set all sorts of animation properties, such as animation duration. Let's remove the old stroke end implicit animation. The from value is going to be the previous stroke end value. And the to value is going to be the stroke end's new value. Let's create an animation using the stroke end property. And set up the from and to values. Set the duration to 1 second. And add the animation to the foreground layer. This string value stroke is just a name for the animation. It's not the name of an actual property. So let's build and run and see what we've got so far. The animation happens, but it disappears. Remember how I said the animation takes place on the presentation layer? That's the presentation layer you're seeing animate for a duration of 1 second. We have to specifically assign the to value to the model layer. And build and run. But now you can see that the animation is happening on the presentation layer, but the model layer is also being updated. We still have implicit animation on the model layer. To get rid of this, we have to make sure that we update this value before we add the animation. Core Animation at this point is only going to do explicit animation. So we'll move that and build and run. And now the animation is behaving itself. Now that you've seen how this works, we can actually lose a lot of the code. We can get rid of the from value, as the presentation layer will work on the previous stroke end value. We can also move the to value directly to the foreground stroke end. This is where we set the model layer's value. So we're just left with this 4-line code. And build and run. And the animation looks pretty good. There's one more thing we can do to make this code better. Instead of drawing the arc in the view, we can make an arc layer draw itself by subclassing it. Let's create a new class arc layer as a subclass of CA shape layer. We'll set up the arc with a color in init. And we'll set up the stroke color, line width and fill color. These are the same values we had before for this path. Now we have a required initializer, so let's fix that. And we'll cut build layer and paste it into arc layer. And we'll remove the lines we don't need. We've set those in Init. And we'll change the path property. The shape layers, instead of setting them up as CA shape layers, we'll set them up as arc layers. And that requires a colour. So I'll copy this colour. And we don't need the CG colour. And now we can take out the initialization from layout subviews. We still have to update the layers bounds here though. It's when we update the layers bounds that we'll build the arc to the correct size. We're still not calling build layer here. So we'll override the layers bounds property and create the path when the layers bounds change. Oh, we don't need the parameter here anymore. And because we've set the bounds, we need to update the correct position to the center of the view in build layer. So the control is working the same, but we've separated out the layers so that they build themselves, and we can reuse this arc anywhere else. There's one thing left to do, so let's build and run and see what it is. When I click the plus, I get a fatal error saying use of unimplemented initializer init layer. This is due to a quirk of core animation. Remember that when we assign any value to a core animation property, it does implicit animation and creates a presentation layer for the animation. The presentation layer, when it's created, looks for init layer. So all we have to do here is create an empty init layer. And build and run. And now everything works as expected.